Hello and welcome to this download from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is Christopher Potter, author of the recent book You Are Here, A Portable History of the Universe. As the title and subtitle suggest, Christopher is in pursuit both of the origins and history of the universe and our place in it. Christopher, who's spent most of his career as a publisher, writes in the book's first chapter. Like many who have come to writing late-ish in life, it took a crisis to get me here. So I began by asking him to tell me more about what had led him to tackle these big themes.
I'd really sort of run out of steam, I think, with my work as a publisher. I'd been a publisher for 25 years. But beyond that, there was another sort of crisis. I lived very much in my head. I was a very rational being. And yet I knew there was another sort of part to me that probably was sort of hidden or private, which is, I suppose, what we might call more spiritual. I actually had a sort of physical and mental breakdown, and it was out of that, though actually I don't think breakdown is the right term. I like to think of it as a sort of cracking open rather than cracking up, because actually I'm really glad that it happened now. I think it's one of the best things that actually happened in my life. And it's like some sort of deeper part of oneself is telling you that something has to change. And I became very aware that the mind and the body, there's no real distinction to be made between them, particularly in the circumstances I then found myself. I could have a thought that could trigger a panic attack just as much as it might be something that I'd eaten. And there were physical things that had gone unbalanced in my body and in my mind that both triggered this crisis in a sort of idea of who I was as a self. And so I suppose that forced me to think, well, what is a material description of the world? And I thought, well, perhaps this is a way of beginning a book that is about my great interest, which is what is the nature of science? There are a lot of books about what scientists do by scientists or by historians of science, but I didn't feel that there was really a book about the philosophy of science, and that sounds rather high-minded, which wasn't the kind of book I wanted to write because I'm not a philosopher. But I thought it was a way in for a more general reader who might not otherwise ever read about science if I could take a more discursive approach to writing about science than actually some sort of catalogue of discoveries and of scientists' biographies, and concentrate more on the ideas and the methodology of science, and which basically can be reduced very simply to the idea that there is some sort of external reality that's made out of things that move. And so scientists go out there with their measuring instruments to determine what it is ultimately that things are made out of and what we mean by motion. And it turns out it's actually very hard to answer those questions, but also the answers that come up are very interesting. And out of that I was able to sort of structure a way of going through the history and philosophy of science as a journey through the universe, through sort of time and different dimensions of space, sizes of space.
You start the book with that experience which I think most of us have had as children, where you write your address on a book and you gradually expand out until it embraces the whole universe. And you talk about the universe as both attracting and repelling you. And I wanted to ask you to expand a little bit on both the attraction and the repulsion that the universe provokes in you, because that, I suppose, is one of the mainsprings of the book.
Well, I wanted to start with the idea of the address and the thing that we do as children, because I think children instinctively have some sort of understanding that being human is rather an odd and interesting predicament, and children do continually ask why, and they often ask questions that are very hard for adults to answer. And very early on, children are aware or want to know what death is. They are aware that there's something odd about nothingness, or where it is that they've come from so recently, or where it is that dead things go to. As well as this thing that we do as children, where we write out our address and try to place ourselves within the universe, as if we need to know what an address means and how we can place this idea of home. So I thought I would start the book, which in some ways was, a ridiculously naive venture to say that I was going to write a book about the universe. I thought, well, I might as well take advantage of that and start from the sort of perspective of a child, with the sort of fears one might have of the immensity of the universe, and try and reassure the reader that I shared some of those fears, and then guide the reader gradually out into the larger universe. And I think some of the fears I have about science are some of the fears I think many people have, and who might, and reasons why they might never read a science book. Science, I think sometimes one can fear that science is going to tell one something that one would rather not know, that we don't have free will or something, or take away the mystery of something, which, Richard Dawkins had his book Unweaving the Rainbow, in which he attempted to show that in fact the mystery increases rather than decreases, which is something I wanted to show too, that actually the more we know about the universe from a material description, in a way the more mysterious and immaterial it begins to appear. And science, I think in our age that we live in now, with the great sort of worry about what may actually happen to our planet and what we've done to it, I think perhaps we do need to rethink our relationship to science, that we can't go on just doing science in the old way where we just think there's an infinite resource of energy and we can just progress in the way that science has progressed. We're having to rethink about the connectedness of everything, and actually one of the things that I love about science is that it actually reveals the connectedness of things, even though it begins from a premise that things are separate. In a way, the separation is the artificial thing that science does in order to then describe how you can put the pieces back together again. And I find that fascinating, and it's also then an area that begins to relate to other methods of truth-seeking, like religion or poetry or music, that also have some instinctive idea that things are actually connected and not separate.
With a lot of cosmology books, I think, I'd for one quickly become bamboozled and find that the quantities and the numbers that are being talked about are very difficult to grasp. And I thought you had hit on a very clever and immediate way of making both the very big and the very small graspable, and you use a sort of crescendo and decrescendo in both cases. A little bit about what you were doing there to try and make things more readily seizable.
Well, I thought it was a useful way of actually leading somebody away from their comfort zone quite quickly, and also a way of encompassing initially by going out from things that we're comfortable with and things that we're familiar with, of sizes that are, relate to the size of ourselves as human beings, and then gradually move out from sort of, natural objects like trees or rivers and cathedrals, or, not that they're natural, but man-made objects that are tall, and the Eiffel Tower, and then going out into other powers of size, perhaps out gradually to man-made satellites, and then gradually leaving the Earth altogether and moving to the first natural satellite of the Moon, and on to the nearest, to the planets and the Sun, and then other suns and structures of galaxies. And it turns out there aren't that many structures. So I could do that quite quickly and show to the reader, well, this is materially what we think's in the universe. But of course it doesn't answer some of the deeper questions, like what's the universe actually in? So if there are all these structures, why do they end? Why don't they go on endlessly? And so then I was able to come back to other questions about the philosophy of science and what it's actually doing, and a history of motion, that we don't actually understand the universe by going out into it and exploring it. We've hardly, in fact, travelled very far into the universe at all. The universe comes to us because we see it gravitationally or through light.